Hi there. Well, I've been asked to do a film on fly fishing, and I don't pretend to be any expert. I've fly fished for many years, but I'm not a fly fishing teacher. I hope I'm a good teacher, and because of that I can share the experiences that I've had over the years and show you how to catch fish on flies. Now let's start by what are we going to use? What are flies? Obviously you know flies are little things that buzz around in the air, but fly fishing is to make an artificial lure that represents flies, and it's used in many different ways. It can be the adult fly that's hatched and is flying around in the air and lands on top of the water. It can be the young fly just hatching, a young nymph just coming out of its pupa case like a caddisfly before it takes off and dries its wings. It can be a small insect of any sort, like a water boatman or a little beetle or a shrimp working in the water. And it can be similar to a fish, a small fish, or another small living organism that swims around in the water that fish will eat. And these come under the titles of dry fly, wet fly, nymphs and lures. So let's take a look at those four, shall we? Here's a selection of wet flies. I'll show you them more closely now on the camera as well. You see that these little wet flies represent small insects that swim in the water, even small fish at times. And these are fished underneath the water with a sinking line. And you can have various speeds of sinking line. You can have a lead cord line that will go very quickly down to the bottom, or you can have lines that sink at different levels at different speeds. And when you're an expert, you might have 3 or 4 spools of these lines, which you can just clip onto your reels to fish different waters, whether they're very deep waters, very fast waters, and you want to fish at different levels because the fish may be feeding on the bottom or in the middle or on the surface. So these are wet flies to be fished under the water. Next we come to nymphs and lures. Here's a selection of nymphs. I'll show you those on camera now. And these are the things that are just hatching out from the chrysalis and rising up in the water and are trying to get out of the water usually to dry out. Below that we have the lures. These represent larger insects or fish, and again both of these are fished under the water. The lures are fished usually with a slightly heavier line and fished a bit faster and jerked like a small fish, whereas the nymphs can be fished very, very gently, and quite often are fished not only with a sinking line but can be fished with a floating line, so that the leader, the line at the end of the heavy fly line, which I'm going to explain in a minute, will sink below the water. Sometimes they're even fished just off the bottom. These little boobies here will be fished on the bottom and they'll raise up just off the bottom and the fish will grab them that way. It's all quite complicated, but we'll go through it as we go along. These flies, again I'll show you now on camera. These flies are the floating flies. These are the adult emerge flies, and this is probably the most delicate and, for me, the creme de la creme, the cream of fly fishing. You fish these on top of the water with a floating line and you actually see the fish rise and take it. With all of the others you either see the line tweak or you just feel a slight bite. With these you actually see and have to strike at the right time, and I'll show you an example of that on this film. These flies are salmon flies and they're much larger, and you'll see on the photograph now that some of them have 2 hooks, not just one. Some people are against that because that one hook can actually leave the other one out. They're much larger flies, and you can see they represent again different small fish or insects or even shrimps. The salmon aren't supposed to feed when they come upriver, so it's more a matter of enticing them or making them slightly annoyed to actually grab at the fly, and then you can hook your salmon. This is a set of lures from New Zealand, and just look how individual and special they are, and you have very big trout in New Zealand. New Zealand being one of the best fly fishing countries there is in the world. You might have a mouse, and this is almost the size of real mice here. You might have a little frog or a dragonfly as that one. And you see these are lures, and again they'd be fished either on the surface or just under the water, and the big brown trout over there grab them, some of the big rainbows. Finally we come to what we carry the flies in. In this case a little plastic box, and you can see how I've just put my flies in layers so I can reach them when I want. Or again you might have a fly box like this which has 2 lids. You can see here my little nymphs, weighted nymphs, one of my favourites, with a little brass head so that they sink and draw very, very well. Again my little set of water fleas here and shrimps, and on the other side I've got some lures and even come down to some little spinners if I actually really get caught short, some little flickers and things. They're considered cheating by the purist, but if you're really stuck for fish and you need your dinner, well, I'm afraid needs must at times for me. So we've seen our little fly box here of which we carry our flies in, in this case with the 2 lids. Now let's look at the rest of the equipment we need. It's very, very basic in most cases and very, very simple. This object here is called a priest. If we catch a fish, over the head with it. It's made of metal, but inside it is a very interesting little device. Unscrew this and there's a little spoon-shaped thing. And this is called a marrow spoon. And you push this inside a dead fish to see what the fish have been eating. And then you can see what sort of flies you should be using if you just caught them by chance or more by luck, because you had to catch the first fish in the first place. So this is called a marrow spoon, and you can see what the fish has been eating and therefore choose your flies accordingly. Of course, at first you're going to look at the flies that are floating around in the air or see what's in the water. Maybe even carry a small net just to dip and see what there is. But experience will tell you at the time of year. Next, when you've caught your fish, you'll need a landing net. This one you just hang on your side here like this, and to undo it we simply do that, clip it up, and instantly you've got your net ready. With a twist I can lengthen it so I've got a full length of net, and then to unlock it all I have to do is pull this up, it holds down and clips back on my belt. So a landing net, a special landing net for fly fishing, which will extend. Then we come down to these two little items. This is called mucilin, and it makes the line float. When you have a floating line, the main line itself will float already, but the actual trace line, the fine line that comes up the end of your fly line, which the fish don't see, the ordinary fishing line, has to be coated in some mucilin to make it float if you're using a floating line, and the flies as well. So what you would do is, you'd put your fly in here, you'd put the top on, you'd shake it up, the fly would be covered in this liquid, and then you take it out and you begin your fishing. You do not coat the trace line more than 4 inches down to the fly. So if the fly is here, 4 inches of ordinary line, and then you coat it above with the mucilin. You leave 4 inches without coating on so that it sinks slightly and the fish doesn't see it as he rises for the fly. Quite a good trick that, but worth remembering. Now we come down to the actual tackle itself. Here you see I have a spool, and here a reel of exactly the same type. Now what this means is that if I want to change lines at any time, all I've got to do is press this button here, this spool lifts off, and I can instantly change to another line. This saves me having to change reels, having to change rods, whatever. So if you buy a reel, it's worth having 2 or 3 spare spools to that reel with your different fly lines on. This one in this case is a slow floating line. Sorry, this one in this case is a slow sinking line. You can see by the green colour. Very often they're colour coded. There can be several colours, but a brown or a green or a grey is usually a sinking line. A white or a light green is usually a floating. This one's a floating line. Now the difference in fly lines and ordinary fishing line, let's just have a look at that, shall we? If we come up close to this, you'll notice here that there's a heavy line here, and this is a very fine line, like ordinary fishing line. It is ordinary fishing line. In this case I'm using about 5 pound for the trout around here. And I have the length of the rod, or a bit longer, of this fine line. And then eventually we come to the fly line itself, of which there are several types and many weights. A heavy line for a heavier, bigger rod, or a lighter line for small streams and a lighter rod. It's joined by having a sleeve of clear plastic and then some braided nylon, which is slipped over the main line. When you buy this, the instructions come with the packet, so you'll know how to do that. But it saves tying knots in the line. This grips the fly line, and then the fine line is tied afterwards, as you can see. The fish isn't going to worry about that because you've got about 10 or 12 foot of the ordinary fishing line afterwards. This is the slow sinking line, of course. So I'll just wind that back on again. Of course it comes out this direction. Now the rod itself, you can get all sorts of different fishing rods, double-handed salmon fishing rods, all sorts. This is a 3-piece salmon rod, for instance. It's a much longer rod, and it's a double-handed rod to carry quite a heavy line and get out for those big fish. You see, it's a very long rod. And you see it's a much bigger reel as well. We hold this one so, we'll be casting, letting line out through the finger, double-handed like that. Big heavy rod for salmon and big sea trout. Be quite handy for pike as well, I guess.